It's Tuesday the 17th, and this is micandbike. A nice, cool June morning. I wouldn't think it was summer. Definitely feels like spring. So much so that I actually put a coat on this morning. So many different topics to choose from today. I suppose I could start with the show Orange is the New Black that is new season is just released on Netflix. My wife and I have been watching that lately, and we'd watched season 1 last year, so into the second season now, and it's set in a women's federal penitentiary. Interesting word, penitentiary. So it comes from, derived from penitence, which is to atone for one's sins, I suppose. I guess I get to wait for the bus today. I think these shows about prisons are always fascinating because it's something different, something that's out of the context of most people. And I think women's prisons are even more interesting because they're even odder. I mean, such a small number of people go to women's prisons. In men's prisons, there's a higher percentage of men go to prison than women do. And there's tons of movies and so on about men's prisons, so it's like just not as interesting anymore because it's so covered. But women's prisons, well, that's a little more novel. Although there have been a series of shows over the last few decades set in women's prisons. I think there was an Australian show called Wentworth from the 70s, and there was also a British show. I think Germany even had a show about a women's prison years ago. I watched the recent Australian Wentworth. They did a remake of the original 70s series. And that was interesting. But you compare some of these shows to like Wentworth or Orange is the New Black, to a show like Oz, HBO's Oz, which was about a very brutal male prison. There's a definite difference in the degree of brutality and so on that goes on. But I'm not sure that really applies. I've read articles about Oz saying how that was really an exaggeration. But then I've also read articles about Orange is the New Black saying that's an exaggeration as well. So I think all shows exaggerate for dramatic purposes what happens and goes on. Kind of goes without saying. I'm sure that many of the things that happen in these prison shows may have happened. There may have been an incident or some incidents where they happen, but they don't happen on a frequent basis. It's like in US prisons, men aren't getting shivved every day. I think these are relatively rare occasions when that does occur. I think it's a common theme in many of these prison dramas that the people, the inmates, a very common theme is that they take someone who's from a middle class life, never being violent, is going to prison for a relatively small thing, and all of a sudden they're confronted by all these inmates who are hardened criminals. And I mean, it just seems to happen again and again. It's a common theme in all these prison shows. And I think it makes sense because it makes it easier for the audience they're trying to reach, to relate to. Because they could see themselves in the main character who's going through this experience in prison. And as these stories progress, in almost all these prison dramas, this fish out of water, this middle class person thrown in amongst criminals, learns how to become a hardened, tough person themselves. I know Wentworth, the recent version of Wentworth, ended with this middle-class woman becoming exactly, one of these hardened criminals herself, and her sentence, so much so that she murdered somebody, and her sentence was extended. So you almost have the impression that these prisons, these shows give the impression that prisons, once you're in, you never get out. Because in order to survive in the prison, you have to become so cruel that it pretty much brands you as a hostile element that society will reject and make sure you never get out again. Hey, similar thing happened in Oz as well in the end. The main character got out eventually, only to be sent back again. So I think that's rarer than these shows make it seem, that people who've never before experienced prison and lived relatively tame lives become hardened, violent offenders after they go to prison. I mean, there's so many people who go to prison for white-collar crimes and so on and are released and never go back again. I think the recidivism rate amongst those people is relatively low. Certainly, when they do go back, it's not usually because they were committing violent crime or had been converted from a white-collar to blue-collar to violent crime criminal acts. You think of Mark Whitaker, who was in jail for something like 8 years for embezzling money from Monsanto. He got out and hasn't been back. Think of Michael Milken. He went to jail for, well, I think they got him on account of mail fraud or something. But he hasn't been back. I don't think Ivan Boesky's been back. Yeah, a lot of these white-collar people, it's often one-time deals with them. Okay. I don't think Lord Black, Conrad Black, the Canadian newspaper mogul, I don't think he's been back to prison since he got out either. Hello. Still, these stories or these prison dramas they always have this appeal to them, despite their formulaic quality. I think the appeal of prison dramas is similar to the appeal of a car accident. Everybody's drawn to them. It's kind of fascination with gore or horror, and thinking that, thank heavens, it's not me. Then there's prisoner of war stories too. Boy, this genre is kind of deep actually when you think about it. You've got movies like Bridge on the River Kwai, The Great Escape with Steve McQueen. Hello. Yep. And it's also interesting to see these same shows, the same genre played out in different countries. You know, how are the prisons in Australia different from the prisons in America, different from the prisons in Britain? And in all these shows, these different across the countries, they have different. It's interesting to see how the different ethnicities play the underclasses. In the Australian prisons, you got the big hulking Pacific Islanders in prison. America has got the blacks and the Hispanics. And all these groups play to the stereotypes, of course, in these shows. You know, it's kind of demeaning in a way, because all of these shows certainly depict that white prisoners can be cruel, and there are, you know, hardened white criminals incarcerated who are dangerous, but they all have a white middle class main character who's the fish out of water. I mean, it all makes it seem like white people are the only ones who have a segment of their population that is not involved in or hasn't become hardened criminals. And all of the minorities, they always seem to show up as pure formed evil, like out of the womb almost. They lack the nuance of their white characters, at least certainly the central character. But again, this may be true, but I don't think it's overt racism. I think a big factor is that these shows, they're commercial products. And why do they exist? To sell things. And who is their biggest, richest target market? White middle class. So you're going to target your shows at them, because that's your biggest revenue is going to come from that. last thing you want to do when producing entertainment is to make your audience feel uncomfortable and bad about themselves. That just decreases your audience. Who wants to watch that? And certainly who in your target audience of consumers would want to watch that, would want to feel bad about themselves. Well, this draws to the end another episode of Mike and Bike. And I look forward to seeing you all next time.